Family invites don't come often, at least not for me. And when they do, they usually come too late, like a cold apology after the wound's long healed into scar tissue. So, when I received the ivory envelope from my brother Victor, thick paper, gold trim, formal font, I didn't know what to think. Anniversary weekend, luxury resort, all expenses paid. Melinda must have written it. She always did love appearances. I held the invitation in my hand for a long time, unsure if it was meant for me or just a formality to avoid guilt. Still, a part of me, a stubborn part, wanted to believe it was genuine. I hadn't seen them in over a year. Life, they'd say. Schedules, kids, the usual excuses, but I always reached out. Holidays, birthdays, little notes. They rarely answered, and when they did, it was stiff and short, like replying to a stranger out of courtesy. Still, I tried. Maybe this was their way of trying too. So I booked a train to Lake Geneva, packed my weekend bag with the best I had, and told myself not to expect anything. Just go. Just be present. Maybe this time would be different. I arrived at the resort mid-afternoon. The air was crisp with the edge of spring, snowmelt pooling around the bases of budding trees. The main lodge stood tall and elegant, dressed in soft wood and stone, like something out of a lifestyle magazine. As I stepped out of the cab, I paused, gripping the handle of my suitcase, staring at the place they chose. My heart was cautiously open, just wide enough to let hope breathe. Melinda met me at the entrance. She smiled like someone greeting a neighbor she barely remembered. Polite, bright, and cold around the edges. "Oh, Verena, you made it," she said, kissing the air near my cheek. "You found it okay?" "I did," I replied, offering my own practiced smile. The others were already inside. Laughter echoed from the patio, clinks of glassware and soft jazz flowing through the open windows. Melinda gave me a quick tour, her heels tapping on the polished wood floors. She pointed out decor like she'd personally curated it. "Isn't it elegant? A little upscale for what we usually do, but Victor wanted to go all out this time," she said, glancing sideways at me. "You know how he is." I nodded, pretending not to notice the way her eyes trailed over my coat, my shoes, my hair. "My room was at the far end of the property. Beautiful view," she said. "Quiet," she added. It felt more like away. The bed was made perfectly, but the window stuck when I tried to open it. The porcelain bell left on the nightstand for all guests. Mine had a thin crack running along its side. Dinner that night was in the grand hall. Long tables, polished silverware, name cards. Mine was missing. Melinda waved it off. "Oh, must have been an oversight." I sat between two cousins who barely spoke. Victor gave a toast, but never looked my way. It was subtle. That's how these things go. Not cruel, just enough to make you wonder if you imagined it. Being talked over, forgotten in group photos, given the last pick of everything. But I smiled, I always did. Smiling had become armor. The next morning, the sun broke through gray clouds and poured over the patio. We gathered for brunch. Mimosas, fresh fruit, soft music. It was picturesque. Too perfect. That's when it happened. Melinda, dressed in white linen, swirled her wine glass and laughed at something Victor said. Then she turned to me with that same smile, the kind that doesn't reach the eyes. "This place is a little above your class, isn't it, Verena?" It was a joke, or meant to sound like one. The table went quiet. Someone coughed. Another shifted in their chair. I didn't speak. I just sat there, the words hanging in the air like smoke from a fire you didn't know had started. No one said a thing. Not even Victor. I stood up slowly, muttered something about fresh air, and walked toward the lake. The wind stung my cheeks, but it wasn't the cold that made my eyes water. I kept walking until I found a quiet bench under a naked tree. I sat and stared at the water, letting the silence settle in my bones. This wasn't new. The feeling of being tolerated instead of welcomed, of being the afterthought in a family I once bent over backward for. I thought I had made peace with it. But words have a way of cutting where you didn't know you were still raw. Sometimes, your family knows exactly where to strike. Back in my cabin, the afternoon light had dimmed. I took off my coat, sat on the edge of the bed, then reached for my laptop. I didn't open it out of anger. I opened it because something inside me had shifted. A clarity, not rage. I opened a new email draft. Subject: Resort Ownership. I typed a few lines. Facts, dates, the name of the LLC. How 5 years ago, I'd made some smart investments. How I'd bought this place, quietly, no announcements, just mine. Because I wanted something for myself. And I knew even then they wouldn't understand. They didn't need to know, not yet. But now I had a reason to let them show their true selves. I saved the draft, closed the laptop, and exhaled. I wasn't ready to tell them, not yet. But oh, I would. After the silence of that afternoon by the lake, I returned to my room, washed my face, and stood in front of the small closet. I took my time picking an outfit. Not flashy, not loud, just one of my own designs. Simple, graceful. The kind of thing I knew Melinda would never recognize as mine. She didn't follow my work. She barely acknowledged I had any. But I wore it with pride, a quiet nod to what I'd built without applause. The evening air had cooled by the time I stepped out. Soft lights glowed across the pathways, casting long shadows that reached across the polished stones. The main lodge, with its timber beams and warm interiors, felt like a place where people gathered to be seen. Every detail, every finish. 5 years ago, I picked them myself. Funny how no one remembered that. Or maybe they never knew. A hostess greeted me at the entrance. "You with the Melrose Group?" she asked. I nodded. "Follow me." "Mrs. Melinda left instructions." Of course she did. Inside, the hall was already buzzing. I followed the hostess to the entrance where a printed seating chart was posted on a brass easel. My eyes scanned the list once, then twice. My name wasn't there. Before I could speak, Melinda appeared beside me, holding a flute of champagne like a prop in a play. "Oh, Verena," she said, like she'd just noticed me. "We weren't sure you'd stay for the whole dinner, but there's a cozy table near the fireplace, just through there." She gestured casually, her voice coated in sugar. I smiled, small, tight, and nodded. "Thanks for thinking of me." The room spun around me, but my feet kept moving. At the small table, I found 2 extended cousins I hadn't seen in years and a couple I didn't recognize. Likely business friends of Victor. They greeted me politely, distracted, clearly more interested in the main table where the real family was seated. From across the room, I could see Victor, deep in laughter, raising his glass. I waited for him to glance my way. He didn't. Melinda was mid-story, loud enough to carry, talking about how exhausting family events were. "Managing people's expectations is a full-time job," she said, eyes darting toward me like a knife dipped in honey. The first course came, wrong plate. "Sorry," the waiter said, startled. "I thought, never mind." He paused, looked at me more closely, then quickly walked away. I caught a whisper behind me. A man leaned in toward his wife. "She's just here for the food, right?" The woman chuckled under her breath. I didn't turn around. I didn't flinch. I simply placed my napkin in my lap, cut into the meal, and ate with the kind of composure that looks easy until you know how much it costs. They gave me a seat but took away my presents. That's fine. I'll take back the whole room when I'm ready. After dessert, some glazed thing I barely tasted, I slipped out the side door and stepped into the night. The wind had picked up. I pulled my shawl tighter around my shoulders and walked down to the lake again. The water was darker now, the moon a dull smear behind thin clouds. I walked slowly, letting the cold bite, letting it remind me I was still alive and still capable of being hurt. I thought back to childhood dinners. How I'd always been the one smoothing over tension, bridging the silence, the peacemaker, the quiet one. That was the role given to me. But peacekeeping comes at a cost. Visibility. You make yourself small enough to not start fires. Eventually, you disappear. "Don't raise your voice," my mother used to say. "Raise your value." I used to believe that. Still do in a way. A groundskeeper passed by, nodding at me respectfully. His name was Joel. Been with the resort since before I bought it. He knew who I was. His nod wasn't casual, it was acknowledgement. That moment reminded me that truth doesn't need volume, it just needs time. Back in my room, I kicked off my shoes, lit a candle, and sat at the desk. I opened my journal, flipped to a fresh page, and wrote, "Visibility is not granted, it's claimed." I stared at it for a while, then reached into my bag, pulled out the cracked porcelain bell, and placed it gently on the nightstand. Still there, still mine. My phone buzzed. A group text. From Melinda. "Brunch tomorrow at 10. Family only." I looked at the message, then locked the screen. Instead, I opened my resort's financial dashboard. Quarter-end numbers looked solid. My name, bold at the top, was a silent reminder of everything they refused to see. I smiled, not kindly, not cruelly, just enough. "Let's see who really belongs here, Melinda." I woke to the soft hum of voices drifting from the patio below. A group text had arrived overnight. "Family brunch, patio dining, everyone be on time." It wasn't addressed to me. I sat on my balcony, cradling a mug of tea, watching them gather in the morning light. The chairs, the linen cloths, the chatter, they were rehearsing a family play I was never meant to belong to. Victor walked past my door without knocking. He never asked if I wanted coffee, never paused for a greeting. A housekeeper passed, smiled, and addressed me by name. That, more than any absence, stung hardest. In that moment, I felt the sharp edge of being both welcomed and unseen, sidestepped by those I called family. They didn't push me out, they just never pulled me in. After a moment of stillness, I folded the invitation and slid into the hallway. I replayed memories I'd tucked away. 3 years ago, they convened a meeting about selling our grandparents' property. I'd researched alternatives, suggested a plan that preserved value and honored legacy. When I spoke up, Melinda placed her hand over mine and smiled, saying, "We're trying to keep things simple. You tend to get too emotional." Victor did not stop her. He did not nod in agreement. He said nothing. His silence echoed louder than her condescension. I remember the meeting room table, the way they passed my documents sideways, never meeting my eyes. I understood then. My voice existed only when convenient. Silence became my armor. I learned to sit down when people talked over me, nod when my ideas were edited, smile when my name was omitted. Over time, I built a cage from my own restraint. Protection, they'd say, but at what cost? Every time I quieted a wound so others wouldn't hurt, a piece of me eroded. My late grandmother used to say, "Still waters hold strength." I believed it then, clinging to quiet. But strength in silence is a shadow until someone steps into the light. I found an old, unsent email draft titled, "What You Took From Me." It sat frozen in my outbox, dated months ago. Tonight I opened it quietly. I read lines I never dared send, how I built this resort, how I let them think I was just a guest in my own story. I paused. My fingers hovered. I didn't hit send. Not yet. I whispered to the room, "One day, you'll hear me, even if I have to shout with silence." Later, I walked the cliffside trail just as the laughter from brunch rolled down like waves. The wind carried it. I stopped mid-step. There, a staff member, young, nervous, was being scolded by Melinda for a trivial mistake. Their eyes locked. The look on her face was quiet pain, a reflection of years I ignored. In that instant, I felt a shift inside me. I did not step forward, not then, but the seed of resistance settled solid. I wasn't excluded. I was erased, and I'm about to rewrite the script. They sent the message an hour before the meeting. "Family alignment session, conference room B, see you shortly." No salutation, no name, just another move on their chessboard. I arrived 15 minutes early. I always do, old habit from years of showing up prepared, even when they didn't notice. The room was cold, formal, long table in the middle, windows draped just enough to keep light out, but keep image in. I scanned the nameplates. Mine sat at the very end, closest to the exit. Of course, Melinda was already there, clipboard in hand, speaking in that overly sweet tone she saves for moments where control dresses itself as cooperation. "Verena, I hope we can keep emotions in check today," she said as I walked in. 1,000 replies came to mind. I offered none, just nodded and took my seat, letting her think she'd set the tone. I scanned the room instead. Victor stood near the coffee station, raising his glass in a casual toast. To shared vision, he said, and to those who help hold it all together. He didn't look at me when he said it, but he did place a hand on Melinda's shoulder. It was subtle, but not to me. The cracked porcelain bell sat on the edge of the podium, unrung, forgotten, like me. Later, as the room settled into polite murmurs, Melinda made her rounds. She stopped at my seat, smiled like we shared a joke only she understood. You've always had good taste, Verena. The decor here is stunning. A little too refined for how sensitive you tend to be, but still, well done. I didn't flinch. Not even a blink. I simply nodded again. From behind me, a man's voice lowered. I admire your restraint, he said. One of the board members' husbands, I think. I didn't even know his name. Across the room, Sela leaned into Desmond and whispered, not softly enough. Maybe she's not strong enough for this role. I heard it, every word. I filed it away, like I had done for years. A young staff member walked toward me, holding blueprints, property expansion plans. He looked confused, checking a name. Are these for… I took them. Yes, I'll review them. He didn't question it. This whole event, they called it a meeting, but it was a verdict. I knew it the moment Melinda offered croissants and not eye contact. They weren't aligning vision. They were drawing lines. I wasn't just out of the conversation. I was the subject of it. I excused myself halfway through the second agenda item, citing a call. Walked straight down the hall, past catering, and into the file room. It was exactly where Melinda would keep her versions of the truth. She always needed control in hard copy. It didn't take long. Middle drawer. Folder labeled Public Presentation. The ownership draft showed her name listed first. Percentages skewed. My name. Missing entirely. Another folder. Internal copy. This one showed the correct allocations. My ownership still intact. Watermarked, dated before the revisions. They weren't careless. They were calculating. I took photos. Every page. Then messaged Malachi. We proceed at noon. When I returned, nothing about my face had changed. But the air around me had… I could feel it, sharp, aware. They rewrote reality. I'll remind them whose hand built it. Melinda was already talking again. We're making small changes to table arrangements. Nothing major. I cleared my throat. I'd like to see those changes in writing. With signatures. You could feel it, how silence shifted. Not just surprise, tension. Her smile held, but only barely. I sat back, folded my hands, watched the wind pick up outside. One page from the earlier draft had been left on the table, angled just so the afternoon light hit it. My name still intact, faint under the watermark. They erased my name, but they forgot to erase the truth. The garden was hushed when I walked into it. Twilight's hush, the air heavy with thunder's promise. I tread slow along paths lined by low hedges, leaves glistening with moisture, each step a drumbeat in my chest. I found my grandmother's memorial bench and sat down. The inscription, "Speak only when your silence is no longer protection," felt like a lightning bolt aimed at my heart. Silently, I let years of grief settle, the distance, the omissions, the quiet betrayals. Tonight, I wasn't bound by restraint. I let myself cry, not for them, but for me, for the versions of me they never let live. I thought back to dinners I silenced myself during, conversations I folded so others might stay comfortable. Fear dressed itself in peace so long I called it virtue. Now I saw it for what it was. I deleted the unsent email, no more drafts that never fly. I wrote a new one, shorter, colder, unburdened. When I reached my suite, I chose a black dress, simple, commanding. It felt right, like stepping into a role I'd earned. I slipped the USB into my coat pocket, labeled it Melinda's Mirror. In the lounge, the air hummed with banter. Melinda held court, sipping her wine. I approached a well-known family friend and dropped the USB into his hand. "This might give you a fuller picture," I said quietly. He looked at me. No shock, just recognition. Melinda glanced up. Her eyes flicked to the handshake she couldn't parse. Tension pulsed, but no one broke the flow of small talk. The weight hung. That night, I sat by my lamp, journal open. I listed times I'd made myself small: the boardroom, the dinners, the calls I didn't make. Then I listed what I built anyway: my brand, my resort, my vision. Their validation had never been currency. I murmured to myself, this ends when I stop needing their acknowledgement to breathe. Exhausted, I set pen down and closed journal. Thunder cracked outside, a breach in the sky. My phone buzzed. A text from a cousin. "You might want to see this. It's starting." The screenshot showed the family friend had forwarded the USB's financial proof to the group chat. Whispers erupted across devices. Melinda responded coldly, "That's not the full story. Let's not jump to conclusions." I didn't reply. I turned off the phone. I stepped outside onto the balcony and faced the storm. Rain pelted the stone rail. Lightning split the sky. I inhaled deep. This was more than upheaval. This was the beginning of reclamation. Some storms you wait out. Others, you become. They called it a review session. That was Melinda's language. Soft words to dress hard intent. By late afternoon, I walked into the boardroom knowing this wasn't about review. It was about rewriting. The air was thick with quiet calculation. The long oak table gleamed under recessed lighting, and a stack of contracts lay neatly arranged near Melinda's seat. She smiled as I entered, that same polished warmth she used to butter a knife before cutting with it. "Glad you could join, Verena," she said, gesturing to a chair halfway down the table. "We're just finalizing some updates for the investor group." I sat, letting silence build weight. She began her presentation: numbers, percentages, structural refinements. And then she said it. "This reflects the current ownership model." My name never appeared. I waited for the slide to change before I spoke. "May I see my name in the version you're quoting?" Every head turned. Melinda froze. A flash, barely there, crossed her face. Then came the stutter. "Of course, well, I'm sure it's included in the appendix." "It isn't." My voice was calm, but it sliced clean through the room. I reached into my folder and placed two sheets side by side, hers and mine. The original contract, photographed weeks earlier, my name still inked and legal. A murmur swept across the table. Investors shifted. One cleared his throat. "This appears different," he said. I didn't demand an apology. I didn't raise my voice. "Let the original document speak," I said simply. Melinda's jaw tightened, her knuckles white on the edge of her chair. The facade cracked. After the meeting adjourned, she caught me in the hallway. Her perfume arrived first, sweet and venomous. "You'll regret exposing me," she hissed. "You think this makes you strong? You don't want a public scandal, Verena. You have things to lose too." I turned to face her. Everything I built, my work, my name, was done in daylight. "You can't expose someone who already stands in truth." Her eyes hardened. She spun away, heels striking the marble like gunshots. Around us, staff members glanced quickly, pretending not to hear. I pulled out my phone and sent the contract scan to Malachi, CCing key investors. "Proceed," I wrote. Then I walked into the lobby, head high. Guests paused mid-conversation, sensing something shift, like static before a storm. Later that evening, I found myself in the corridor lined with mirrors. My reflection met me in fragments, angled, multiplied, unflinching. For the first time, I saw no trace of hesitation, just the steady resolve of someone done being erased. My grandmother's words whispered in memory. "When your silence is broken, your truth echoes." I opened my laptop and drafted a public statement. Brief, factual, no drama. Just ownership clarified, transparency affirmed. I read it aloud once, steady as breath. "Let the world hear me," I whispered. Not through anger, but through certainty. By the time I reached the main hall, Melinda was already there, gathering guests with her best hostess smile, spinning her narrative. "Misunderstandings happen in business," she said lightly, voice carrying across the room. I stepped forward. "If I may address everyone." the sound of chairs shifting, murmurs quieting, glasses lowering. It all slowed to a pulse. I held up the original contract, my signature visible under the lights. "This isn't a misunderstanding," I said softly. "This is clarity." Gasps. A few quiet nods. Even Victor looked stunned, caught between denial and recognition. Outside, thunder rolled. Inside, the air broke open. This wasn't a confrontation. It was a reckoning. Even as dusk settled, the lights in the main hall burned bright. The resort's grand event was in full swing, tables laid out, guests milling, cameras set up at the balconies. Melinda stood at the podium, perfectly poised, introducing her new investment plan. Her voice carried across the hall. "We are expanding, acquiring new properties, taking full control of future growth." She spoke with certainty, as though she already owned every brick. I sat in the audience, quiet but alert. The memory of contract revelations earlier still burned in my mind. She was attempting to rewrite us, to make it look like I'd always been secondary. A guest leaned forward and whispered, "She's taking the spotlight again." That remark felt like a punch in my gut, and a confirmation. The room was tilting. I clenched my jaw, steadying the storm inside me. As Melinda detailed her new partnership, the slide behind her showed logos and projections, but no mention of me. The omission was eloquent. I realized then she was trying to erase me in front of every witness. I sat tense, feeling the tide shift. Midway through her pitch, Jasper Monroe entered quietly beside the stage. The MC's voice crackled. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have a special addition to the presentation." The screens behind flickered. Documents started scrolling, contracts from years ago, transaction ledgers, emails signed by me. Gasps filled the room. The crowd froze. Melinda's smile faltered. I rose. I heard murmurs, cameras shuddering. I approached the podium with what felt like both fear and certainty. "This resort wasn't built by rumors or showmanship. It was built by me," I said, voice steady. Eyes turned. Some faces went pale. Others glanced at each other. The auditorium split between shock, support, and confusion. Melinda's recovery was immediate, too immediate. She cleared her throat and responded, "These documents are suspect, perhaps altered. Mr. Monroe has relationships here." She gestured, falsely polite, casting doubt. She leaned into her microphone and declared, "I fear this is orchestrated to overshadow genuine leadership." Inside, I felt betrayal in slow motion. Some investors whispered together, glancing at the screens. A few stepped aside with Melinda, nodding, building their own narratives, but many sat frozen. I did not back down. Later, I slipped into a dim corridor away from the glare. My heart pounded. Fear trembled at my limits, but I recalled Grandma's voice. "Truth carved in quiet is stronger than lies shouted loud." I raised my phone and sent a private note to key guests. "You see the truth now. Decide who you stand with." Stepping back into the hall, I found the buzz had shifted. The storm outside broke, thunder echoing above. Hall lights flickered, mirrors trembling slightly in the windows. The air tasted of revelation. I walked to the center, shoulders straight. The guests hushed as I passed. Melinda looked up, her posture brittle. I met her gaze without flinching. Tonight they see me, but tomorrow they'll have to believe me. By nightfall, the resort glowed under a storm-dark sky. The hall was full, board members, guests, media, even staff who had drifted to the back, drawn by the tension thick in the air. I stood near the podium, hands steady, though my heart thudded hard enough to echo in my ears. This was it. The night everything tilted. Melinda sat in the front row, perfect hair, perfect posture, her face composed like marble. Cameras flashed as I stepped forward. I laid the documents on the table, one by one, contracts, statements, emails. Then I looked out across the room and said, "You can rename me, reassign me, but you cannot rewrite history." The silence after those words was deep enough to feel. A few heads turned toward Melinda. Some leaned in, others looked away. I pressed the clicker, and the big screen flickered on. 2 contracts side by side, her version and the original. Mine bore the signatures, the dates, the marks of truth. Hers was stripped clean, sanitized, falsified. The air changed. You could almost hear trust evaporating. Melinda's mouth moved, but sound didn't come out. Then, as if shocked into motion, she stood and pointed at me. "These are forgeries," she cried. "She's staging this entire thing for attention." She grabbed one of the printouts from the table and tore it down the middle. The sound ripped through the hall like thunder. A few of her allies stood, muttering support. But before she could speak again, Jasper's voice rose from the back. "Let the evidence speak louder than theatrics," he said. His tone was calm, almost weary. Heads turned toward him, toward the journalist who had confirmed every document. Whispers rippled through the audience. Phones lit up. The tide shifted in front of us. I didn't say another word. My silence felt heavier than any accusation could. I just stood there, steady, while Melinda's certainty began to crumble in real time. A woman from the audience, an older guest who had stayed at the resort for years, rose slowly and began to clap. It wasn't loud, but it carried weight. Another joined, then another. Within moments, the room filled with quiet applause. Melinda froze, lips tight, the kind of fury you can't disguise. Investors who once circled her began texting, whispering to each other, the way people do when realignment begins. Even the press shifted focus. Questions changed tone. Cameras angled toward me instead of her. Her lawyer moved discreetly through the back, phone pressed to his ear. I could see the color draining from his face. Something was unraveling behind the scenes. Fast. Outside, the storm broke open, rain hammering against the balcony glass. Lightning lit up the hall like a camera flash. I turned toward it, the glow washing over me. They saw me tonight, I thought. Tomorrow, they'll have to believe me. I walked toward the balcony, the door creaking as I stepped into the rain. The air was electric, clean. For the first time in years, I felt the weight shift off my chest. When I turned back, the hall was still alive. Voices, flashes, confusion. But through it all, Melinda stood alone, eyes following me with a mix of rage and fear. I met her gaze once, not as rival, but as mirror. Then I walked forward, slow, certain, unshaken, toward the place that had always been mine. This night promised exposure. Tomorrow, they'll demand it. The first sunrise after the storm looked softer than I remembered. The sky over the resort shimmered pale gold, the kind of light that touches everything without demanding attention. I walked through the garden slowly, the wet stone path gleaming from last night's rain. The staff greeted me with quiet smiles, their eyes warmer than before. No tension, no whispers, just peace. It had been 3 days since that night. Melinda had left the island before dawn the next morning. No announcement, no goodbye. The board confirmed her resignation by noon. The world, as it turned out, moves on quickly once truth takes the floor. I passed by the main hall, where the echoes of applause had once felt like thunder. Now it was calm, filled with the scent of fresh lilies. Someone had replaced the old family portrait with a new painting, abstract, bright, and free of signatures. I stood there for a while, then smiled. It felt like breathing after being underwater too long. When I stepped into my office, sunlight spilled across the desk. I ran my fingers over the polished wood, cleared out the last few folders she'd left behind, and placed a small photo of my grandmother by the window. That simple act felt like reclaiming something sacred. Later that morning, Jasper stopped by. He didn't knock. He just leaned against the doorway with 2 mugs of coffee. "You didn't just win," he said, setting one down in front of me. "You reset the standard." I chuckled softly. "I don't know if I'd go that far." He shrugged. "Well, the world noticed." We sat near the open window, watching the waves break against the cliffs. We talked about the resort's future, about rebuilding the culture from the inside out. I told him I wanted to start a scholarship for young people who'd never think they belonged in a place like this. "Hospitality shouldn't just be for the privileged," I said. Jasper nodded, eyes steady on mine. "Then that's your legacy, not revenge, but renewal." Before he left, I told him I'd decided to rename the oceanfront suite after my grandmother. He smiled at that, a knowing kind of smile. There wasn't much else to say. That afternoon, I sat in the lounge, sorting through a stack of letters that had arrived since the story broke. Some typed, some handwritten, all from strangers. Women mostly, older, some retired, some widowed, each thanking me for standing up when silence would have been easier. One note caught my eye. The handwriting shaky, the paper thin. It said, "You spoke for us when no one else could." I placed it in a drawer beside the others and locked it, not to hide, but to preserve. Those words were not for the world to consume. They were mine to remember. That evening, a guest approached me near the terrace. She was maybe in her 60s, elegant but kind-eyed. "You know," she said, "I watched that video of you speaking. I've been pushed out of places too." "You gave me a bit of myself back." Her voice broke near the end, and before I could stop myself, I reached out and took her hand. For the first time, I didn't feel like I was defending anything. I was sharing it. The video from that night had already reached millions of views, though I hadn't watched it once. The media wanted interviews, features, headlines. I said no. What mattered to me wasn't the noise. It was the quiet that came after. As dusk settled, I wandered back toward the garden. The same spot where I once sat alone, swallowing humiliation under Melinda's sharp words. Now, only the wind spoke. I lowered myself onto the same bench and whispered, "You are not what they said." For a moment, I let the memories play. Late nights at the desk, contracts spread across the floor, phone calls that ended in silence, the sting of disbelief. I let it all rise, and then let it go. The tears came without pain. They felt like cleansing. The resort lights flickered on one by one, glowing against the coming night. I looked out over the sea and smiled, not from triumph, but from peace. My phone buzzed. A simple message from my father. "I'm proud of you, baby." I read it twice, then turned the screen face down. The stars were beginning to appear. Owning something is easy, but rebuilding yourself, that's the true legacy.